Tendo muita gente que veio ontem, que está aqui hoje, que para a gente é um ótimo indicador, que vocês voltaram. Eu queria pedir para quem está bem no fundo e chegando mais perto, para a gente ficar aqui todo mundo mais próximo. Para quem está chegando hoje, bem-vindos, bem-vindas. Esse é o segundo dia do encontro, organizado pelo Ibirapitanga, Memória, Reconhecimento e Reparação. A gente teve um longo dia ontem, mas muito intenso, muito bonito, muito forte. E hoje a gente tem também uma programação bastante intensa, que começa, né, com 2 sessões agora de manhã, o almoço aqui no espaço do museu. Para quem está chegando hoje, a gente almoça todo mundo aqui. 2 sessões à tarde e a gente encerra com um coquetel e com uma apresentação musical, e a gente convida todos vocês para permanecerem aqui até um pouco mais tarde hoje. Mas a minha fala, principalmente agora, além de recebê-los novamente aqui, é agradecer ao MUCAB por nos receber nesse espaço tão acolhedor e com tanto sentido, com tanto significado para essa discussão que a gente está fazendo. Eu estou aqui com a Heloísa Helena Queiroz, que é gerente de museus da Secretaria Municipal de Cultura, responsável pela administração, pela gestão do museu. Eu falei isso no início, né, da sessão de ontem, mas quando a gente começou a pensar esse encontro, né, fazer esse seminário sobre reparação, sobre memória, a primeira decisão que a gente tomou foi que a gente gostaria de fazer aqui no MUCAB. E a partir daí outras decisões foram sendo tomadas, né? Então faz muito sentido para a gente estar aqui nesse espaço, trazer pessoas para cá, pessoas que conhecem, pessoas que não conhecem, tanto pessoas que estão aqui no Rio como pessoas de fora. O MUCAB está situado aqui na região da Pequena África, que é um dos lugares mais importantes de memória negra, não só do Rio de Janeiro, do Brasil, do mundo, né? E é muito importante conhecer e honrar esse espaço que a gente está presente aqui hoje, e que dá força para as discussões que vão acontecer, que aconteceram ontem e que seguem hoje. Mais uma vez agradeço, Heloísa, pelo acolhimento e desejo a todos vocês um ótimo encontro hoje, e queria passar a palavra para a Heloísa também para fazer umas boas-vindas para vocês.
Obrigada. Bom dia a todos. Bem-vindos ao MUCAB. O MUCAB é o caçula da Rede Municipal de Museus. Ele é um museu que ele tem a sua formalização, né, o seu decreto de criação em 2017, mas a ideia de criação de um museu aqui neste local já é muito antigo. Já é muito antiga essa ideia, esse desejo popular. Então, ele é um museu que ele nasce de uma parceria de várias instituições, da sociedade civil também. Eu tenho aqui hoje várias pessoas, vários parceiros que participaram da idealização desse museu. Ele foi concebido dentro de um projeto ligado à Unesco, Cais do Valongo, Museu de Território. Então, é muito bom ver esse museu se consolidando cada vez mais, sendo mais conhecido, mais reconhecido e, principalmente, atraindo parceiros tão importantes, como é o caso do Ibirapitanga, que justamente escolheu o MUCAB para realizar esse encontro nesses 2 dias. Eu gostaria de convidar todos vocês que ainda não conhecem o museu, que conheçam o museu, a sua programação, todo o trabalho desenvolvido por essa equipe tão dinâmica e pelos seus parceiros. Eu espero que seja um primeiro momento dessa nossa parceria com o Ibirapitanga, que outros momentos ocorram. O MUCAB está aberto a diversas parcerias e eu espero que vocês desfrutem muito desses momentos aqui no MUCAB. Meu muito obrigada e a presença de todos vocês.
Obrigado, Heloísa. Queria convidar a Juliana, que vai introduzir a nossa próxima sessão. Juliana Maia.
Obrigada, André. Bom dia, bom dia. Como o André falou, eu sou a Juliana Maia, sou gestora de portfólio no Ibirapitanga. Antes de compor a mesa, queria fazer 3 avisos. O primeiro é que o nosso evento está sendo traduzido, então, caso você precise de suporte, a nossa produção fica feliz em te ajudar, com tradutor, enfim, com o radinho. O segundo aviso é que o evento está sendo filmado e fotografado. Então, caso você tenha alguma questão com a captura e o uso da sua imagem, por favor, nos deixa saber. Também basta sinalizar para a nossa produção. E o terceiro aviso é que a gente ficou muito feliz com a repercussão do dia de ontem. A gente acompanhou a repercussão a partir das redes sociais também das pessoas que aqui tiveram. Então, caso você deseje postar, filmar, fotografar, por favor, marque a gente nas redes sociais para que a gente também possa participar, curtir, compartilhar. Dito isso, aos trabalhos do dia. A mesa é da memória à reparação. Caminhos à reparação, reconhecimento da dívida histórica. Quero começar convidando, então, o professor Justin Hansford. O Justin é professor, diretor executivo e fundador do Marshall Civil Rights Center e membro do Fórum Permanente das Nações Unidas para Afrodescendentes. Além disso, Justin é pesquisador e ativista nas áreas de teoria racial crítica, direitos humanos e a relação entre os direitos humanos e os movimentos sociais. Convido também Natália Oliveira. A Natália é socióloga, pesquisadora e ativista. É fundadora e diretora executiva da Iniciativa Negra por uma Nova Política sobre Drogas. Ela atua na construção de uma agenda de justiça racial e econômica, propondo reformas na atual política de drogas. Bem-vinda, Natália.
Olá, bom dia a todos. Bom dia. O pessoal está animado mesmo depois do dia de ontem. É um prazer estar aqui. Queria agradecer a toda a organização do evento, com toda a atenção para a nossa chegada até aqui. Estive dando uma olhada na programação de ontem, na parte da tarde, assisti tudo ontem. Muito bons os debates. Espero que o dia de hoje seja tão produtivo quanto o de ontem. Certo? Bem-vindo, Justin.
Prazer.
Prazer. Bom, a ideia do dia de hoje, né, a gente seguir no diálogo de ontem. Acho que ontem a gente trouxe bastante de uma memória, né, como é a proposta do evento, e já começamos a esquentar bastante, né, sobre a questão das discussões sobre reconhecimento e reparação. E acho que o dia de hoje traz esse fechamento. Então, eu vou... Cadeira. Então, eu vou ler um pouco do que a gente separou aqui para a introdução dessa discussão. Vou te fazer algumas perguntas, Justin, e aí você vai respondendo conforme for o seu tempo, tudo tranquilo. Depois nós vamos abrir para perguntas do público. Você terá tempo de respondê-las e a gente encerra com as suas considerações finais, com as respostas do público. Tudo bem? Então, vamos nessa. A história, a despeito de sua dor dilacerante, não pode ser desfeita. Mas, se olharmos para a história com coragem, não precisaremos vivê-la novamente. Maya Angelou. Na declaração produzida em 2001, durante a Conferência de Durban, contra o racismo, a discriminação racial, xenofobia e intolerâncias correlatas, a ONU reconheceu a escravidão e o tráfico de africanos como crime contra a humanidade, bem como o direito à memória como política de reparação. Recontar a história é produzir memória, e esta pode nos conduzir para um caminho de justiça e igualdade, respeito e democratização dos territórios e direitos. Esta mesa tem por objetivo discutir como políticas de suporte à memória de determinados grupos sociais podem intervir como meio de reparação, salientando a sua importância na sustentação de políticas públicas e iniciativas que visam reduzir desigualdades antigas e persistentes, seja na luta das mães e dos familiares de vítimas de Estado, do enfrentamento à violência racial, na luta pelo fim do encarceramento em massa, na contestação e destruição de monumentos nacionais, ou na construção de tensionamentos e novas narrativas históricas. Essa mesa se propõe a debater o poder político da memória e sua relevância para a transformação social. Então, diante disso, acho que eu queria começar pedindo para o Justin assim, um pouco, eu sei que está na programação a biografia, mas que ele se apresentasse um pouco e trouxesse rapidamente a relação da tua pesquisa, da tua ação política, com essa temática que a gente está provocando o início do debate na mesa aqui pela manhã.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for coming here this morning. I have to say that it's a pleasure to be here to speak to Brazil in particular because in the United States we have a very special focus on the experience of African Americans in the United States, but we don't talk enough about what's happening with Black people throughout the diaspora, and not only what we can exchange and give in terms of concepts to Black people throughout the diaspora when it comes to racial justice movements, but also what we can receive and what we can learn from racial justice movements around the world. My work began initially as an activist against police brutality. And I was involved with an organization called Malcolm X Grassroots Movement that had engaged in organizing for those who were former Black Panthers who were imprisoned in the United States. We also had concerts, hip-hop concerts, and worked with the hip-hop movement. In a past life, I even was a rapper myself, if you can believe that. But I became a human rights lawyer because I believed that we needed more tools for activism that would even change law so that our activism could be made firm and it could endure over time and not just be pushed back. So now I'm a law professor, became an attorney. Now I'm a law professor at Howard University. I teach critical race theory. I teach constitutional law. I teach human rights law. I happened to be in St. Louis when Mike Brown was killed in 2014, which was the start of the Black Lives Matter movement, along with the killing of Trayvon Martin and the killing of Sandra Bland in the middle of the last decade. So from that engagement, I started my own center, the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, and probably most relevant here, I became a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. This is a part of the United Nations that works on fighting for human rights for people throughout the African diaspora. And I know some people in the audience have been to our meetings. But going back to the first point I made, though, one of the ideas around racial justice that I want us to begin to exchange with each other is the idea of reparations. Reparations is a concept that at the United Nations Permanent Forum, it unites Black people throughout the diaspora who have been part of the transatlantic slave trade's legacy in a way that no other issue has done so. Because it speaks to how we respond to legacies of enslavement, legacies that include racism, structural racism, that include police brutality, that include fighting against health disparities. In the United States, it's diabetes and sickle cell, Black maternal mortality. It allows us to talk and fight about poverty, fight against poverty in the Black community. Reparations is the one concept that for me is going to be our concept going forward in the 21st century of what justice looks like for the Black diaspora. So understanding that what that concept of reparations, to me, is core to our unity as a diaspora in the fight for Black people all around the world. And it's not just about money. It's not a financial repair concept alone. In a very capitalist country like the United States, we think about reparations, we say, show me the check, cash the check. Show me the money, right? Like Rihanna said, they better have my money. But around the world, especially in the United Nations, which itself has colonial history, so we have to keep that in mind. There are 5 levels to reparations. So yes, there is this idea of compensation for past work that was done that was never paid for. But also there are more healing elements to reparations. Non-repetition, creating laws that ensure that you don't go back and replicate the crimes of the past. Those laws don't only mean not replicating slavery, but also, in a legal sense, the incidents of slavery, the legacies of slavery, like structural racism. So the affirmative action law, for example, is a type of guarantee of non-repetition that is part of the reparations discussion. Also, rehabilitation, so supporting mental health for those victimized by the legacies of slavery. Finding ways to provide access to health care, again, not as public policy, not as charity, not as benevolence, but as justice for the harm that was done by this society. We're also talking about other elements that are going to be not just based from the government. We're not only looking for reparations from the Brazilian government or, from a colonial sense, the Portuguese government, which was also involved in slavery and colonialism, but also the church. What is the role of the church in Brazil when it comes to racial justice? What is the role of universities in Brazil when it comes to racial justice? What reparations do the universities pay? What is the role of philanthropy? I know I'm getting some people nervous. We talk about philanthropy, but what role has philanthropy played in the ongoing legacy of racial justice, and how there has been not only racial disparities in giving, but how was the wealth created that philanthropists use to go ahead and fund projects? Was it created through wealth gained unjustly? What is the role of companies, the private sector? How has the private sector gained from racial injustice? What would they pay? So it's a concept of justice that enters us into conversation with various elements of society who are all responsible for our harms. And as a result of that, they're all responsible for our healing if they're going to be part of a true racial democracy in terms of society.
Bela trajetória. É muito parecida com a trajetória de vários sujeitos negros no Brasil, né? Essa praxis orgânica que envolve um processo de iniciação política através da cultura hip-hop. A escola do hip-hop também é uma grande escola, máximo respeito à nossa escola do hip-hop no Brasil também, e acaba entrelaçando, né, com essa atuação política, também de pesquisa acadêmica, né? Acho que é quase como se fosse uma necessidade e urgência de nós, sujeitos negros, para se colocar diante das nossas injustiças. Mas vamos lá. Pegando um pouco do que você falou sobre o que foi discutido na ONU, etc., sobre reparação, então, é exemplo do que aconteceu em Durban, mais de 22 anos depois, que tipo de dívida, né, mais específica, a comunidade global tem com vítimas do tráfico transatlântico? Qual o papel que a sociedade civil tem em responder a ela? Acho que dialogando com isso que você começou a trazer agora para nós, se você pudesse entrar um pouco mais sobre isso, trazendo esse papel da sociedade civil em relação a isso.
Yes, so I created an organization called the African American Redress Network, which combines the work of Howard University, which I always give a shout out to Howard. I'm an alum of Howard, former student, and I'm a professor there. the best historically black college in the United States. And we combined with Columbia University to create a network to support reparations movements around the country. We have over 40 municipalities in the United States that have created reparations commissions. And those commissions didn't happen by accident, and they didn't happen as a gift. In each of those cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Detroit, even Boston, and much smaller towns that you may not have heard of, Asheville, North Carolina, Evanston, Illinois. Groups of civil society movement organizations formed a coalition and began to demand that their mayor begin a process of racial healing for structural racism in that city, meaning that they had researchers that looked at the history of racism that that particular city, not the whole country, but that city was involved in, whether it was housing segregation, whether it was disparities in access to clean water, whether it was disparities in policing, brutality, right? They created a report, and civil society organizations began to organize and demand hearings on how the city was going to fix those racial harms through a commission. So what we did as a organization, we would provide researchers, students, to help them draft these reports. I'm an attorney, so we would provide legal analysis for why a reparations commission would be seen as within the laws of that city and state, help to draft the commission. We did everything, basically. We did everything except sign the paper. We left that for the mayor. But for us, again, I don't know how it translates in Brazil, but for us, we have more power locally than we have nationally. Our federal government I think, is going to take many years before they pass a reparations bill because they're scared. They don't have political courage when it comes to reparations. You can quote me on that. They don't have political courage when it comes to reparations. But we can push our mayors, we can push our city council, we can push our local government officials to start the conversation once civil society organizations forms coalitions for reparations that happen locally. Two elements that I did not talk about. I was going to mention 5 elements of reparations, right? I talked about compensation. I talked about non-repetition. I did not talk about the importance of memory as part of reparation. That was the third element that I left out. It's compensation, non-repetition, memory. We call another term we use called satisfaction. And in addition to compensation, you also have rehabilitation type of financial harm. So not only do you pay back for work that was done for free, but you also pay damages. These are legal concepts. So not only do you have to repay black people for free labor for slavery, but you also pay damages. So for any harms that came about, any injuries to the community that came about as a result of the free labor. Those are 2 different levels of financial compensation, right? So those 2 financial levels, we have non-repetition that can include laws. We have also memory. We have to have a truth before you can have reconciliation. In the United States, we have critical race theory and the history of black people in the United States being banned from being taught in cities like in Florida, in the state of Florida, in Texas. They're banning the teaching of our history. In response, we need to make it mandatory that we teach our history as part of our reparations movement. That is a movement that happens locally in the United States. So we go to our school boards, we go to our mayors, and we say in every curriculum for kindergartners, for children in grade 1, 2, and 3, teach them about slavery, teach them the truth about racial injustice in our country, teach them about racial injustice in your city. The histories of racial injustice in your city have to be on the curriculum. And these are all things that we have to look to civil society to lead on, because politicians are not going to lead on it. No other part of our nation will lead on it. Even the historians who know the importance of memory oftentimes are not activists. It's very rare to have activist historians. So civil society really has a responsibility to push local government officials on all 5 elements of reparations, but especially on memory. Hope you understood that answer.
Bom, vamos lá para a penúltima pergunta. Quais iniciativas já existentes são exemplos bem-sucedidos de políticas de memória como reparação e qual o seu potencial transformador na luta contra a violência racial? O que ainda falta ser feito?
Yes, so for the first part of your question, we have examples around the world of interesting and you could even use the term successful reparations initiatives on each of those 5 elements. So remember, it's a 5-part analysis. So let's just take one, memory. In the United States, we have created a museum, 2 museums I want to mention. One in Selma, Alabama, which is a historical location for us. That's where we did many civil rights marches. We have a lynching museum. I'm not sure if the audience is familiar with the history of lynching in the United States, but that was a type of racial terrorism used about 100 years ago, where they would hang black people from trees, usually accusing a black man of assaulting a white woman. Oftentimes it was a false accusation. A black woman who was a journalist uncovered that they would select the most economically powerful black entrepreneurs, and they would target them and accuse them of assaulting a white woman, and they would lynch them. They would come in as a mob, and they would hang them from a tree, and they would have parties around these lynchings. There were pictures taken. Sometimes they even took pieces of the person's body as souvenirs, right? We have a museum of this where we have listed all of the different lynchings. You could have over 1,000 lynchings memorialized. And in the museum, they took soil from the lynching sites all throughout the country and put this soil in the museum so you can touch it. It's a very spiritual experience. This is one example of allowing our legacy to not only be never forgotten, but allowing us to actually touch parts of our legacy and find that spiritual connection to our ancestors. But even more recently in Chicago, there's a museum called the Chicago Police Torture Museum, which was created after a finding of police violence in Chicago in 2014, where the police were involved in a scandal of putting electronic currents on the genitals of black people to coerce confessions. Horrible history. So now we have memorialized that history of police violence in Chicago, and every school child, before they can graduate, has to visit that museum and to go through and learn about how racist police torture was a part of the legacy of slavery that endured all the way into the 2000s. And I want to use those 2 examples to show that it's not just slavery itself that has to be memorialized, it's all of the legacy of slavery. And the connection needs to be made when you talk about memory. All the way from police violence to lynching. And of course, in Washington, D.C., we have a National African American History Museum that was created under President Obama. So we have all of these different levels of memory that can be captured and that are for many people in the country, are the #1 source of historical education. Most of our youth don't learn about Black history in our schools primarily. They're going to learn it from us, or they're going to learn it from a museum. So it's one of our responsibilities to create those sites of memory as part of reparation. In addition to that, we have movements for financial reparation in Haiti, to receive reparations from France. We have CARICOM, all the Caribbean nations. Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados has spoken on the global stage about the need for reparations in terms of climate injustice. We have a movement for reparations with the Vice President of Colombia. Francia Marquez has talked about the importance of reparations in her country. The President of Ghana has talked about how he supports reparations, even for speaking on behalf of the African Union. The African Union has now signed off on a reparations plan. We have the Benin bronzes, that, historical masks from African societies that were stolen and taken to Europe have now begun to be returned to their rightful owners in other parts of the continent. And so that includes the Congo. So there's a global movement happening right now. And one of my great hopes is that Brazil can be more and more a part of that global conversation. And the best way to do that, I think, begins with exchanging concepts and ideas about the importance of reparations. And that's the first step. The second step after that is actually beginning to exchange strategies and techniques, and to learn, what historical art needs to be returned to Black Brazilians that has been stolen from them. What is the cultural value of capoeira or samba? How can the cultural value that may have been appropriated and used for profit be returned to the creators of these art forms? The food, the other parts of the culture. For us in the United States, you think about hip hop, you think about things like that have been a source of profit for people who are not part of the Black American community, right? How much of our creation, how much of our work product, how much of our genius has been taken and used for profit that did not go back to us? So this is a long conversation and a very deep conversation that we're only beginning to have around the world. And I'm very excited about the prospect of Brazil being part of that conversation.
Você, acho que trazendo, só as perguntas estavam aqui no roteiro, acho que você falou bem sobre tudo isso, mas para trazer um fechamento, assim, você fala muito sobre a importância da memória, né? Assim, qual que é o papel das políticas de reparação histórica em sociedades nas quais o passado ainda não passou? Porque a gente fala sobre tem a memória do processo de escravização do nosso povo, mas isso deixa um legado. Então, qual que é esse papel dessas políticas de memória num passado que ainda é presente, né, deixa esse legado, e como essas políticas de memória podem mudar o curso do presente?
Yeah, so what is the role of the past in creating policies for the present? So let's take the affirmative action policy, which is one policy that most people are familiar with. In the United States, affirmative action began as a reparations policy. President Lyndon B. Johnson, 1967, came to Howard University and made a speech about how we needed to take affirmative action, that's where the term comes from, to repair the harm done to Black Americans. But only after 6 years, the US Supreme Court decided to eliminate a reparations-based affirmative action concept in a case called Bakke versus the University of California. and said that you can only create affirmative action, not for reparation for past harm, but only to create a more diverse society in the future, only for diversity. So for the subsequent 50 years, for the next 50 years, the goal of reparations in the United States was diversity. It was not reparations for healing past harms. And of course, you know, this summer, the US Supreme Court eliminated even that, right? So affirmative action was struck down this summer in the United States. So anyway, what's the point of that, right? If it's the same program, affirmative action, what is the difference between an affirmative action that is based on memory of the past as a repair for past harms in society versus affirmative action with the goal to create diversity in the future? What is the difference between those two goals for your affirmative action? That's a question I want to put on the table that you can begin to think about. And I don't know in Brazil what is the goal of affirmative action here. Is the goal diversity or is the goal remedy for past harms? But I could say that if the goal is diversity, then what ends up happening is you create an affirmative action program as social engineering, trying to create a proportional elite institutions that have a proportional reflection of your society. So if Brazil is 50% black, maybe 50% of your Supreme Court justices should be black. Maybe 50% of your university should be black. Maybe 50% of your CEOs should be black. That's a diversity-driven affirmative action program, if it's trying to find proportion. But if it's a reparation-driven affirmative action program, then maybe the goal is different. Maybe the goal is not to create just an equal proportion, but the goal is to repair past harm. So whatever harm, measuring the harm that was done, you need to compensate that under those 5 elements. So maybe we need affirmative action so that we can have more healing for health disparities between Afro-Brazilians and other Brazilians in this country. So if there's, say, in the US we have something called sickle cell anemia, which is a disease that is primarily focused in the black community. A reparations-based healing approach, an affirmative action which is based on healing, would find more public funds invested in the healing of sickle cell, not with the goal of creating a proportional outcome. We don't care about the numbers, but with the understanding instead that this is our responsibility, this is justice, this is our duty to ensure that we have full healing for the black community based on this disparity that we helped create as a society, right? So those are 2 different ways of thinking about justice. Is justice a proportional outcome, or is justice about looking to the past and correcting the harms that were done by strategically investing, strategically telling the truth about how the harm was created, going through those 5 elements, strategically engaging in reparation for past harm? So I hope that's clear. So is your affirmative action about diversity or is it about reparation? That's the first question. The second question is, how does that change your public policy? Is it a reparations-driven public policy or a proportionate-driven public policy? Now, I will say, my position is that we should have a reparations-based public policy, because the reparations-based public policy is a public policy driven not by an aspiration of proportionality, which you don't feel that bad if you don't meet, but it's based on justice. It's not based on charity, it's based on justice. It's not based on hope, it's based on duty. It's a different type of reason for why you're pushing for racial justice. But these are the types of concepts that I think we have to debate, because maybe a different society has a different analysis based on their local conditions. So I hope that makes sense.
Começaram a chegar algumas perguntas aqui para mim, eu vou te trazer. Então, acho que eu peguei uma primeira aqui que está muito relacionada ao que você fala sobre a memória e sobre ações, possíveis ações de reparação. Tem uma pergunta aqui que é da Pamela, que ela fala o seguinte: aqui no Brasil, Justin, além de, por exemplo, a utilização da tortura com choques elétricos para confissões de crimes ainda ser uma prática, né, a prática de homicídios cometidos pelas forças de segurança em territórios pobres ainda é muito comum. Muito comum, assim, acontece cotidianamente. Está acontecendo agora, nesse momento, em algum lugar do Brasil, aqui atrás, no outro bairro dessa mesma cidade. Então, isso acaba deixando um legado de familiares vitimados, né, pela violência que os seus entes sofreram e que muitas vezes levou à vida. Então, a gente tem algumas experiências de trabalhos de atendimento psicológico a familiares de pessoas que sofreram violência de Estado, inclusive violência transgeracional. A gente gostaria de te ouvir sobre isso, né? Ver se vocês têm ações relacionadas a isso, sobre cuidado em saúde mental, em especial das mães que perdem seus filhos.
Certainly, that is, I would say, out of all of my work, maybe the most rewarding work I've done is working with the mother of Mike Brown, who was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. He was, started the Black Lives Matter movement, and we created a bill. Howard students, along with Mike Brown's mother, created a bill introduced into Congress in the U.S. by Representative Cori Bush called the Helping Families Heal Act. And that was introduced last year. That bill provides $100 million for the mental health for any families impacted by police violence and their classmates, if they're in school. As we have found, when someone is killed by police, the ramifications ricochet throughout the community. Not only is it just the mother, the mother may suffer deepest and forever, she suffers forever. But the brother, the sister, the uncle, the friends at school, what happens is you are terrorized because police are everywhere. You can't hide from police. You can't respond to police and be violent against the police in return. You can't, their sirens begin and your blood pressure rises when you hear sirens. You may have flashbacks when you review what happened. And we have done actual studies. The University of Pennsylvania did a study that showed that for every police killing, and especially in the US, you have these police killings filmed on cameras, and they play them over and over again on the TV or in your social media. Every time you see that, average black person loses 2 days of good mental health. And it has a similar effect on their blood pressure and a similar effect in terms of stress as diabetes does. It's actually a mental, psychological, physical stressor that has long-term health effects. And our position in that bill, the Helping Families Heal Act, is that the government created this harm, so the government should heal this harm. You started it, so you should finish it, right? And this is another way to think about a reparations-led public policy. Okay, it's not enough for you not to engage in police violence anymore, but you must begin the healing process for the police violence that you have already created. And where I just came from Los Angeles, where we have sheriff's gangs, police gangs. I don't know if they have police gangs here in Brazil, but these are police who get tattoos. Some call themselves the executioners. They run in groups, and they terrorize different members of the community. And so now, when you see a police officer with a certain tattoo in Los Angeles, not only are you triggered because they're police, but you know that they are part of a gang in the police that is specifically violent, right? But again, if you have a reparations-driven public policy, you're going to look at all of these problems from a different lens. The police violence problem, the healthcare problem, the poverty problem, the housing problem, the education problem. All of those problems can be addressed through a reparations-driven public policy, as opposed to a public policy where it's just you're just happy to get anything because you don't have a conservative Trump or Bolsonaro government, right? Reparations public policy says, no, we deserve, as a human right, for atrocities that were committed against us, we deserve healing. We deserve our mental health. We deserve access to education. We deserve access to housing. And we demand it, and we're not going to settle for anything less. And that's the way to approach public policy as a reparationist.
Pegando o gancho do que você trouxe, disso que você falou sobre se sentir bem, né? Assim, a sensação de satisfação, ela tem tudo a ver com a produção de saúde mental. E a gente tem uma dúvida do público, que você mencionou, né, que um dos pilares desses 5 passos sobre as políticas de reparação tem a ver com a satisfação, como nos elementos do processo de reparação. Você pode explicar um pouquinho mais sobre isso? Tem a ver com isso que você estava trazendo agora, com essa sensação de bem-estar?
Right. So think of it like this. If you have been harmed by someone, what does it take for you to feel whole again? If someone commits an act of violence against you, what will it take for you to feel like there's been repair and justice? That is a question that is a very personal question. It is a question that everybody may not answer with exactly the same response. Not everybody can be healed simply by money. Not everybody can be healed simply by an apology. Not everybody can be healed simply through telling the truth. But when you combine all of these different gestures, then you begin to step towards restorative justice. So this concept of satisfaction is a wide concept that includes all of these things. The King of the Netherlands has begun, he did a brief half apology, I say, for slavery. In the UK, I think they have not yet done the full apology for slavery. I know the US has not. We're hoping for a full apology from slavery from the US. But apologies are part, not the whole reparation, but it's part of the healing process. Telling the truth about the history is part of the healing process. Beginning to enter the conversations from a place of repair is just a first step. So this concept of satisfaction includes, it's a menu. It's a menu of different gestures that, according to the UN, if you combine those gestures with financial compensation, if you combine those gestures with other types of laws that are passed to ensure that you don't repeat the history of oppression, if you combine those gestures with these 4 other elements, then you will have a repaired society that is whole again. Now, I do want to say that this is a concept that comes from the United Nations, right? The United Nations has been part of a colonial project from its beginning. We can't ever forget that. I think that there's space for us to continue to think about what is the concept of reparations for your community independent of the United Nations. If you are at a society of African people that were enslaved, combined with other people, indigenous people, what is the indigenous concept of reparations? What is the African concept of reparations? And how do those concepts differ? Is there a spirituality component? How is this society reckoning with African spirituality, and is our current demonization of it? I can tell you in the United States and in the Caribbean, they talk about voodoo, they talk about traditionally African spiritualities as a curse and as demonic. And that outcast status for those who may practice candomblé or something, that's part of the legacy of slavery. That stigma is part of the legacy of slavery. So undoing that stigma may be part of your satisfaction project. And it's something that may be unique to your community. So all of these concepts, so I'll stop there, but the concept of satisfaction is a menu that is part of many different concepts of what it means to begin the process of repair. And it's important to look at it through the unique lens of your country's history, dealing with the legacy of slavery and racism.
A gente passou por aqui um pouco pensando sobre as questões de saúde mental. A gente falou um pouco sobre esse conceito de satisfação que você traz. Agora, tem também essa questão, né, do conjunto de políticas que a gente desenvolve posterior a um fato para que ele deixe de acontecer. Então, a pergunta aqui que chegou a violência policial, assim como nos Estados Unidos, ela é um grande desafio no Brasil. E a gente gostaria de saber quais foram as experiências e propostas de mudança que ocorreram ou propostas que foram debatidas de mudança estrutural das corporações policiais nos Estados Unidos após o assassinato de George Floyd.
I think of that with a sigh, because we have not had a good outcome. And as you know, after George Floyd was brutally murdered and choked out on tape, we had more protests in the United States than any time in history. And I believe even over here you had protests. The entire world was protesting. And we had a bill come before Congress called the Justice in Policing George Floyd Act, which never passed. And the bill itself was a weak bill, which said that we will ban chokeholds, we will ban racial profiling. But what the activists actually were calling for was banning the police and abolishing the police, not banning chokeholds. And when people use that term, abolish the police, they freaked out. Oh, no, you want to abolish the police? This is crazy. They didn't understand the language. What we were saying was reconceptualize. Our goal was to reconceptualize how we thought about public safety in the United States, to not just send a cop with a gun anytime somebody has a problem with another member of society. If somebody's having a mental health challenge, if you send a police officer with a gun there, they can kill that person, as opposed to sending someone with experience as a therapist who might be able to actually help the person and not kill them, right? And we have a lot of police killings that happen as a result of traffic stops. But we know that we have technology now. If they really had to have a traffic violation enforced, you could just take a picture with your phone. You don't even have to have the police get outside of the car. You could have somebody without a gun conduct that traffic stop, and it will not escalate into a killing. You could perhaps, this is crazy, maybe even have less petty violations in the first place so that there will be less contact. We know that the more people have contact with the police, the more violence there is, because police are in the United States are trained like military, and they enter these communities like armies looking for war. So because they're trained as these warriors, the only way to have less violence is to separate and find other ways to create safety that don't include a person with a gun who thinks that you're a mortal danger to them as the first level of interaction. We have in the United States these organizations called police unions, which to me are the unions. They're framed under the labor movement as organizations that fight for higher wages and benefits for police, but the way they function is they protect police no matter what. Even if they're racist, even if they have police gangs, even if they have white supremacy written on their arms, they're going to protect them. And what they also did in this process is they used their power to protect against any meaningful police reform in the United States. So we did not have any law come as a result of Black Lives Matter protests on the federal level. Now, we did have changes happen on local levels, and that was a political education for me. And it just showed the importance of local political organizing, because we're gonna win locally long before we win federally, because our organizing power is stronger there. And I've seen that translate in the reparations conversation now, with, like I said, 40 different cities willing to have a reparations commission. But even President Biden, he's the most progressive president we've ever had on race, even more than Obama, if you can believe that. Because of the protests, he's been forced to be more progressive. But he is afraid and lacks political courage on reparations. But we were able to, my philosophy of change is, if we can get 100 cities to all have reparations and then push the president on the federal level, they can't stop us. They can't stop us. So we go from local to national to global. That's something that we're not able to do yet with policing. We are doing it better with reparations, and we're gonna see in the future if we're gonna have global and national change as a result of this strategy.
Aproveitando que você trouxe, né, para esses aspectos globais, tem duas perguntas aqui que dialogam. Uma é como diálogos transnacionais podem contribuir com políticas de reparação. E a segunda é como o Fórum Permanente tem avançado na participação do Brasil e da América Latina, já que no atual mandato não temos membros eleitos.
I'll start with the second question. I want to go on record as saying that the UN Permanent Forum should have a Brazilian as an appointed member to the Permanent Forum. That's something that I believe in. Thank you. As you know, a huge representative of the Black diaspora, it's mandatory to me. The transnational dialogue is. That's how I got here before you today. We are having a transnational dialogue now. Don't think of the only sites of transnational dialogue as the G20 or the UN or the IMF or the World Bank. In fact, to me, those sites, those locations of transnational dialogue that happen on the political level sometimes are driven, many times are driven first by the transnational dialogues that are happening on the grassroots level and the civil society level. That's the way it should be. Now, we saw that the G20 just admitted the African Union into its membership last week, which is a victory. It's important to have an African member of the UN Security Council. That's one of my goals going forward, to ensure that that happens. It's important that we have a better understanding of the damage done by the World Bank and the IMF, especially when it comes to the imposition of debt. in black countries throughout the diaspora so that we can create debt relief as part of our reparations package. If you look at what Prime Minister Mia Mottley has called for, when she calls for reparations, when many CARICOM countries call for reparations, I believe we also had a number of other Caribbean countries call for reparations. They've been calling for reparations on the transnational level, primarily through debt relief. So we have to understand how debt works when it comes to countries in the global south vis-a-vis the global powers. So, but so this is an important question, right? So when you think about reparations, many of us, especially in the United States-based way of thinking, we think of internal reparations. So what is the repair owed from America to black Americans? What is the repair owed from Brazil to Afro-Brazilians? But it's important also to think about transnational. So let's dig in deep. What is the repair owed from Portugal to Afro-Brazilians? What is the repair owed from the Netherlands to Afro-Brazilians from a colonial standpoint? What is the interaction between countries, and how can we begin to have the conversation? Again, it changes who your target is. Maybe you're not just thinking about your governor or your mayor or even your president as the one who needs to give or open the conversation on reparations. Maybe you need to reach out to the Portuguese government and think about what justice looks like since they started this slavery process, right? So for me, the transnational conversation has always been about opening my mind and bringing in more ideas and bringing in different concepts and different allies to have bigger conversations. And if you think about our reality on the ground locally, it's never independent of transnational currents. Climate change that we're experiencing in Brazil and the US, they are the result of decisions made in faraway places in Europe and with companies that refuse to respond to climate demands, right? So if we're gonna have true justice on all of these levels, we have to think transnationally with our activism and not just locally. So I hope that makes sense. So when you think about reparations, don't stop at Brazil. Don't stop with your mayor, don't stop with your governor, don't stop with your president. Think about Portugal and think about the Netherlands too, and think about and study what they're doing. Study how they're responding to reparations movements locally. And what do the Portuguese think of Brazil? Maybe ask yourself that question. How do the Portuguese even interact with Brazil as at large, let alone Afro-Brazilians? What is their responsibility to you, and what do they owe Afro-Brazilians?
Bom, vou fazer uma pergunta, porque eu vi que não tem veto. A pergunta também de quem está entrevistando. Isso é de muito interesse, em especial, porque dialoga com a temática que eu trabalho. A gente costuma dizer, na organização que eu fundei, que chama Iniciativa Negra por uma Nova Política sobre Drogas, que a guerra às drogas ela é um sucesso no que ela se propõe, na sua intencionalidade racista e de manutenção do conjunto de opressões raciais para o povo negro. Eu tenho acompanhado que, nos Estados Unidos, tem acontecido a legalização, a regulamentação da maconha. Eu queria saber se essas discussões e essas leis que têm sido pensadas de regulamentação da cannabis, se elas têm vindo acompanhadas desse pilar de discussões, desses 5 pontos da justiça de transição. Porque a guerra às drogas é um exemplo disso, né? Assim como a escravização de nós, sujeitos negros, a guerra às drogas ela também é um grande exemplo de um grande complô racista do mundo, justificado numa boa intenção de saúde pública. Queria saber como tem sido discutida essa lógica, a regulamentação da maconha e reparação, memória e reconhecimento.
Yes, in half Maybe in 40% of the reparations commissions that have been created, the first question is, where do you get the money? Where's the money coming from for reparations? That's a question to ask yourself, because that is a first question that is designed to be a stopper of the conversation. Stop the conversation right there. And the answer that many have given for, in the United States is the sale of cannabis can be the #1 generator of money for reparations. And why should the sale of cannabis be, marijuana sales be the way we get money that goes back into the black community? So every sale, now that marijuana is legalized, you get taxed for every marijuana sale. So what will that tax be used for? Will it go to the government to use for roads? Will it be go to schools? Or can it go to reparations? So the reason why reparations is a good use for marijuana sales is because we know that in the United States, the war on drugs targeted black people. That's a fact. There was marijuana used in college dorms around the country, in Los Angeles and Berkeley, very freely. You had people using cocaine even in companies in the rich areas. But the police would take a SWAT team with a full military uniform and a helmet and a machine gun and go into the housing projects and be ready to shoot everybody or arrest everybody if they found an ounce of marijuana, right? So it was a war on drugs, but it was really a war on blacks. This happened from 1980s really until now. It's only beginning to end. So knowing that marijuana was the site where the war on blacks originated, it makes sense for marijuana tax revenue to be part of the process of healing from that war. There's a rationale behind using those funds for reparations. And that's very helpful because we have to be ready to argue our public policy so that when new innovations come that create new revenue for the government or for entrepreneurs, we say, nah, you're not gonna take that money and just buy a yacht or take that money and use it for something of your own independent agenda, but this was money that was created off of a war on blacks, and you're gonna heal us with the revenues first before anything else. So for us, the legalization of marijuana has become a pathway to reparations, and that now what happens now? So now we can combine movements, right? The reparations movement and the marijuana legalization movement, those are two independent movements with different NGOs, different activists, different communities, but now those communities can start to begin to come together and be more powerful together and be more numerous once we see the relationship between our two movements. And that's how we grow and get political victories. So it's a great question. And I think that type of coalition building between movements is the only way that we can get public policy victories in the 21st century. So great question.
Bom, estão chegando mais perguntas, então sinal que está sendo um sucesso. Como você vê a integração cultural e política dos latinos negros aos negros afro-americanos nos Estados Unidos? Compreendeu?
Fala de novo.
Como você vê a integração cultural e política dos negros latinos aos negros afro-americanos nos Estados Unidos?
Okay. Yes. So that's gonna happen culturally, and I will say that my vantage point is as a Pan-Africanist, I'm a Pan-Africanist. I have in my chain here, I have a red, black, and green flag for Marcus Garvey. I'm a Pan-Africanist. And for me, I don't differentiate Afro-Brazilian and African-American struggles. To me, it's a Pan-African struggle. And to me, that's how I integrate Afro-American and Afro-Latino communal inter-exchange is through the lens of Pan-Africanism. But I do want to say that that's a very small percentage of the integration that happens in our diaspora. Most black people see a big difference between a black American and an Afro-Latino. And apparently many Afro-Brazilians don't even consider themselves Latinos per se. And I don't know the answer to that, but Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking communities in the diaspora also have a gap. So the integration of those communities has been slow and piecemeal. Sometimes it happens with culture. You know, we've got Cardi B right now in the United States, who is popular. You've got the history of, Puerto Ricans in the Bronx, in New York, who were part of the starting of hip hop, right? It's always been an exchange that's been present in culture, but in terms of a political alliance, I think that Pan-Africanism has been the vision for a political alliance, but we haven't really had a strong political alliance that I'm aware of between African Americans and Afro-Latinos. Hope and dream is that the UN Permanent Forum will be the beginning of a political alliance in the African diaspora. And that political alliance right now is centered around the UN at the Permanent Forum, but there's great potential for a more robust political alliance that could happen in years to come. But the question becomes, what's the point of that political alliance, right? Do Afro-Brazilians have a particular agenda when it comes to the United States? What do Afro-Brazilians as a community want from the United States? Is there something you want? African Americans, is there something in our political agenda that is urgently calling for an alliance with Afro-Brazilians? What do African Americans want? What are our political interests when it comes to Afro-Brazilians? Right now, I don't think there's a strong African American agenda when it comes to Latin America. That is our fault. That's a missed opportunity. If there's an Afro-Latino agenda when it comes to the United States, we should begin to discuss that. But there have been, and I want to finish here, there have been political alliances, Pan-African political alliances throughout the diaspora, throughout history, right? The obvious example is apartheid in South Africa. When the ANC, Nelson Mandela, and Steve Biko's movement, all those movements were in the midst of apartheid, they came to African Americans with a very developed political agenda. They wanted sanctions against the apartheid government. And so they engaged with our politicians, with the Congressional Black Caucus. We created a movement led by Randall Robinson, some of the leaders of Trans-Africa. We had a movement designed to respond to the political agenda of Black South Africans. So we knew exactly as African Americans how we could help. We could help through sanctions. And so what did we do? We had protests at the South African Embassy in the United States. We fought for the push of sanctions through Congress. And we won because we had a very specific agenda point. And we had a political ideology of Pan-Africanism that drove it. Another example may be Haiti right now. Haitians may have a very specific political agenda when it comes to their engagement with the United States that Black Americans have a role in. Cuba wants to end the embargo. So when they interact with African Americans that support Cuba, they have a very particular political agenda. And it's because you have a particular political agenda, we can respond to that. We can engage with the Cuban embassy, and we can engage with the US government with a policy on normalization of relations with Cuba, right? Economic relations with Cuba. So I know that there are agenda items for the Afro-Brazilian community that it hopes to implement as an internal community. I myself am not aware of the particular political projects that exists right now between the United States and Black Brazilians. But if there is one, that's one of the reasons, that's maybe the main political reason why we have a need for Pan-Africanism in the first place. If you don't have a struggle, then what's the point of having a political agenda to use to win your goals? So that's a great question. I hope there is an agenda item that comes to the forefront that we can use for political organizing. Again, the UN Permanent Forum is meant to be a platform for that. And in June, we had a big meeting at the UN, and the goal was bring your political agenda so that we can hear it and we can start to create alliances. And hopefully that process will continue going in the coming years.
Tem uma pergunta aqui que é sobre a questão da grade curricular nas escolas, né, contando a nossa história. Então, aqui... O trabalho para a construção da memória da história africana ainda é uma ação que as escolas têm dificuldade de fazer. Mesmo que no Brasil a gente tem uma lei, né, que é a Lei 10.639, que institui a educação, esse ensino nas escolas. Pois há um conceito preconceituoso sobre a própria história. Então, muitas vezes vai esbarrar, aqui no Brasil, no caso, as comunidades protestantes, os evangélicos, eles vão dizer que vão se opor às religiões de matrizes africanas. E aí eles colocam que estudar a história do nosso povo é ensinar essas religiões ligadas a religiões que os evangélicos não concordam. Para você ter noção, no Brasil tem um termo super pejorativo para se referir às religiões de matrizes africanas chamando de magia negra, né, como se fosse uma magia ruim e negativa. O que pode ser feito, né, além, claro, da criação da lei, mas no sentido da gente disputar imaginários para essa luta, né, assim, que envolva o respeito, para que as nossas comunidades entendam que o respeito às religiões e à diversidade, elas são uma coisa positiva e vão ajudar na diminuição de violência, né? Assim, acho que, para além da escola, como você tem visto, acho que, nesse esforço imaginativo mesmo, o papel de outras ações para construir esse processo educacional, né? Pois nem sempre a gente vai conseguir ter ingerência sobre como aquele ensino é passado por aquele professor, por aquela professora na sala de aula. Quais são os outros dispositivos educativos que a gente pode contar? Claro que você já citou museus, mas o que você tem visto de mais contemporâneo?
Now I know that in Europe, especially in London, there is a movement to use social media to teach Black history. And there's a creation of a whole community of activists who are using Instagram pages to communicate to the youth in a way that's digestible. Maybe it's through animation, maybe it's through storytelling, not just static history, but in some sort of dynamic platform, so that there can be a way that people can disseminate that information. Nowadays, young people get information more so from the internet than they do from real life, even more so than their classrooms. They're on TikTok all day in the United States. I'm not sure if they also use TikTok here, but those platforms are an opportunity. And as activists, I do think it's a responsibility to meet the youth where they are and meet them on the social media platforms where they are. So that's the first option for expanding an awareness for a counter narrative for Black Brazil. I think that the political movement for an inclusive curriculum in the United States, we use the term critical race theory, but that movement is going to be, for us, it's going to be the most important racial justice discussion in our presidential election next year, 2024 in the United States. I would love to see this question of education and inclusive curriculum on the agenda for the Brazilian presidential election. When they talk about education and politics, it's a question that I have. How often do they talk about this issue? How often do they talk about the role of Afro-Brazilians in education and in the curriculum? Or is the education discussion and politics just about funding schools and bolsa, I guess, scholarships? How often do they, so it's not, moving from access discussions to content discussions is part of an inevitable progression in sophistication when it comes to education advocacy. So there are two methods. There's your own creativity, but there's also the political mechanism of pushing the conversation more towards diversity when you talk about presidential elections or mayoral elections or governmental elections, like say the governor's elections. So I would think about using those two avenues to create change on the question of education.
Bom, Justin, tem água aí ao seu lado, não sei se você percebeu. A gente está caminhando para o final dessa conversa. Queria agradecer ao público que fez uma diversidade de perguntas. Tentei juntar algumas perguntas. Queria pedir desculpa caso alguém não tenha se sentido contemplado. E a gente queria pedir para você ir para esse encerramento, assim, trazendo as suas considerações sobre tudo que foi dialogado. E acho que, se você quiser deixar mensagens e pontos a serem considerados, como, por exemplo, isso que você trouxe, né? Assim, a inclusão da teoria crítica racial na grade curricular é uma coisa que tem sido discutida nos Estados Unidos e é uma medida que a gente pode começar, que a gente pode discutir aqui. Então, acho que você trazer o fechamento das suas considerações finais, trazendo apontamentos também de um pouco de caminhos, né, que a partir dessa realidade que a gente dialogou aqui entre Brasil e Estados Unidos, e te agradecer também pela participação e pela disposição em responder essa gama de perguntas de vários temas diferentes.
Okay. Well, my motto going forward is that reparations is what justice looks like in the 21st century. Reparations is what justice looks like in the 21st century. I use that motto because I think that reparations has to become our framework. Our framework. And what I mean is that in any political discussion we have with any member of the ruling class, any person in power in corporate America or corporate Brazil, in universities, in any space, they have to know that we remember, that we are interacting with them. I'm not entering a room of powerful politicians alone. I'm entering with my ancestors, and I'm fighting for them, and I owe them something, and you have to pay for what you owe to them and to me. And it's a question of justice. It's not, I will not enter a political discussion as a beggar. I will not enter a political discussion as someone who is less than. I am negotiating, and in that negotiation, I have a bottom line, and a line you can't cross. And if I get up and leave the table, you're in trouble. So I want to change our political starting point, our political framework, our political launchpad to be a reparations-based launchpad. In education, in affirmative action, in policing, And in all areas of discussion, I want us to take a reparations mentality into our political debates. So if there's one thing to take away from discussion, it's that. So be a reparationist for the 21st century, because reparations is what justice looks like in the 21st century.